to take a deep breath and roll those shoulders back. Feel your buns in these seats and these feet on this floor. And we've talked about in this Yes and this Collaborate series, there's this posture that we hold as Jesus followers of open hands. It's a posture that we come to Jesus' table with. It's also a posture that we carry out into the world, a posture of generosity. So that's a posture we hold as we settle into this time and continue this Collaborate conversation together. So for me, for years, whenever I first meet people, one of my default questions that I ask when I meet them is, so what's your story? Which some people are a bit surprised and befuddled by, because they're like, what do you mean? My story? I don't know what to say to that. But it generally eventually leads into far more interesting territory than if I just ask, so what do you do? So I have found that it turns out that asking about story is just such a great question. And now that I'm a Jesus follower and I'm a pastor, I realize that this is such a good question for us to keep asking of ourselves and of each other. So my friends, what's your story? It's a question that we keep asking because there are so many layers to the stories, so many different lenses that we can look at as we look at our lives, themes and touch points that we can connect with in our lives. And our stories obviously keep going and changing the longer that we live. So we keep asking this question, what's our story? And the Jesus story is one that invites us to own the stories that we live and to see them as the further unfurling of the Jesus story and the larger story of God that has been told since time began, that we are living that story of God now. And so here at Salt House, we make room to tell our stories. It's one of our core practices, our 7 core practices that just emerged organically out of who we lived into being in the last 3 years. And it's the practice and value of holding that stories matter, which means we try to be present here in this place, owning the stories that we're living right now. Because our stories matter, we try to be curious about the stories of those sitting next to us who we bump up against on Sunday mornings and beyond, because the stories of others matter. And we try to look for resonance in the Jesus story, the gospel, seeing how that connects with our own story, because the Jesus story matters. We are storied people. So we practice this actually every Sunday in those few minutes of our welcome question. You know, we make ourselves talk to each other as we start worship every Sunday. But we just get a little glimpse of each other's stories, often inviting us to reflect on something within our story, our lives, that we may not have considered, at least not recently. And so it's one way that we try to build that into how we are together. And another practice that we have of ours, valuing stories, is making room to hear the stories from people within our community, our own folks with just normal, awesome stories that they're living. And so that we can hold their stories, so that we can hear our own stories in their stories, so we can also hear God's story in their story. And so that also we can be nudged in some way further on and further in to the Jesus story too. So we call this practice that we have telling our Salt House stories. And today we get to hear Anna Offenwanger's Salt House story. Woo! Woo woo! So Anna's been at Salt House 2 years? Is that? Yeah, 2 years. 2 years. And she is someone who really has rolled up her sleeves and been a part of our young adult small groups and studies that have happened. She helps with Salt House Kids. She's on our welcome team. She's one of the first to step up and help out when there's setup to do or cleanup to do, or when if someone needs to sweat it out at one of our work parties, she is there. And most recently, she was instrumental on our Constitution team, helping to sculpt, to write this governing document, our Constitution and bylaws, that is now officially what guides us as a community. So she's a part of that team too. So there's so much more to Anna. We'll get to experience just a brief slice of that, because there's only so much you can cover on a Sunday morning, but we get to know her just a little bit more. So as Anna shares, again, we hold conscious awareness of our own stories. When we hold her story, we hold the Jesus story, because stories matter. So friends, let's give a solid Salt House welcome to Anna.
Hello. Mic seems to be working. Okay, I'm Anna. You might have guessed by now. So I'm going to be starting with a brief description of me. This is me. This is approximately what I look like. I am a software engineer. Change slide, please. There we go. This is me at the start of my career with assistance from my cousin. I'm currently working at Google. I'm also 25 years old. I am 5'8". I weigh 175 pounds, and I have an inherent aversion to North American cultural norms. I never had a boyfriend. I don't wear makeup. I don't own a car. I bike and bus everywhere because it's cheap. And I have no issue telling people how much I weigh. To sum it up, I am, and have always been, a weirdo. So when talking with Pastor Sara about verses to go along with my story, she pulled out Romans 2:12. I didn't think there'd be a lot in the Bible on being a weirdo, but I'm not sorry to be proven wrong. So as you hear this, I invite you to think about how this applies to you, about the things that you do differently. So, there we go. Do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. So, I've got the non-conforming part covered. I grew up in the Okanagan Valley. It's about 5 hours northeast of Vancouver in British Columbia. I have 3 brothers. Here we see 2 of them. They're actually incorrectly labeled. Tim's on this side and Sam's on the other side. I spent most of my childhood with my older brother, David. We played a lot of Lego. I'm talking a lot of Lego. The reason we had time for so much Lego is because my mother homeschooled us for about 12 years. I think that rather heavily contributed to my unusual social development. The best part of homeschooling is that nobody tells you what you should and should not do, or, next slide please, how you should and should not dress. Some things don't change. I was a weirdo for most of my childhood, and it was really great because nobody ever made me feel like a weirdo. Next slide please, with a few notable exceptions. These are my second cousins. This was a visit that we paid them in Vancouver. The picture just about tells how that went for me. I can remember us playing this game which involved spinning around with bits of string. And we had 5 bits of nice ribbons and 4 bits of yarn. So my oldest cousin decided that she was going to take 3 bits of ribbon. My next cousin was going to get 2 bits of ribbon and 1 bit of yarn, and I was going to get 3 bits of yarn. There's nothing quite like luxury distribution to tell you where you stand on the social strata. I can still remember this quite clearly because it was one of the very, very few times in my childhood where being different was a problem for me. For the most part, it was a good thing. I figured out quite early on that if I did jobs before my mother told me to do them, then she'd make my brothers do all the jobs I didn't want to do. And being the only girl in the family, whenever we went on camping trips, I always got my choice of sleeping space, and they got stuck with what was left. So even now, being different, I still see it as an advantage for the most part, but I'm starting to learn that that's not always the case. I'm a woman in software engineering, which means that on a weekly basis, I'm sitting in meetings with a dozen guys, and quite frequently, I'm the only girl. It kind of sucks because there just aren't a lot of women for me to, look to for examples of how to do life as a woman in software engineering. One of the things I really appreciate about Salthouse is just how many tech women we have. Rachel, Kim, and Stephanie all have computer science degrees. On the other hand, if I ever did want a boyfriend, being outnumbered 10-1 is not a bad thing. But quite seriously, my coworkers are really great. I really appreciate the opportunities I've had to learn and grow. They've all been super supportive and made me feel a part of this industry and like I'm capable of succeeding in it. Unfortunately, as I have become increasingly aware, especially in the last couple of years, a lot of women and anybody else who is in any way different don't have this experience. There have been several incidents, next slide, of gender discrimination in the workforce in the last couple of years, several lawsuits, and just a lot of really negative rhetoric. I was reading an article about a company which was making really great progress in gender equality in the workforce. The article was saying that almost 25% of their workforce were women, which on the one hand is great, go out there, make that, progress. On the other hand, really great progress is 25%. So going back to the verse that we were looking at earlier, Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. If there's ever a need for renewing of the mind, it's in this industry. At the time I was reading these articles, I was just getting so angry and frustrated with the whole situation. It really seems kind of hopeless. Progress is just like so slow, and there just doesn't seem to be anything that we can do about it. As part of working through it, I decided to talk to Pastor Sara, have coffee with her as another woman in a mostly male-dominated field. So this is the meeting in Pastor Sara's words. Anna spent nearly the entire conversation in tears, and here's why. Anna works in the tech industry, and it is overwhelmingly, predominantly men. And though our company is doing quite a bit to address this, it is still so obvious that women do not have a place there like men do. And so many of them, not only in her own company, are paid less than men for the same work. She sees pay equity and discrimination, the open discrimination of women of color, of religious minorities. She sees it in the workplaces, but also in the world, in the news, in the kind of memes people make, in the kind of comments people make. And all of this, is why Anna was crying. Tears of sadness, anger for what she sees, but also the reason she met with me. She cried because the question that eats at her is, what do I do? It shouldn't be like this. With all of this injustice and pain I see, I am not doing enough. So for those of you who've been around for a while, if this sounds familiar, it was because it was part of a sermon that Pastor Sara gave back in May 2017 when we were doing our At the Table series. When Pastor Sara asked me to talk about my story today, she particularly encouraged me to talk about this, and that made me think about it. And I realized I don't feel the same way that I did back then. I'm no longer moved to tears by this problem. And to be quite honest, I had a very hard time telling Pastor Sara that. I could see that the passion and the openness that I had displayed then had meant something to her, and it was gone. When I finally worked myself up to admitting that to Pastor Sara, we wound up spending about half an hour talking about it, which told me that even though I don't feel the same way that I did then, I still care about this issue. If I can discuss it for half an hour, obviously I'm still thinking about it. It made me realize that the things that matter deeply to us, like the feelings that really move us, they don't necessarily stay the same. If we don't feel the same way anymore, it's not because that care is necessarily gone. Hello. But it changes. It changes over time. Feelings can still be with us, but in a new way. And while I have no idea what this means for me, whether or not this whole issue of social justice in the tech industry is going to actually matter for me in the long run, given the choice, I would still like to do something about it. I'd like to be part of education. I'd like to be part of, just being in the workplace to show people that it is possible for women to do a good job and to compete with everyone else. So, next slide, please. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. That you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is. People talk about God's will like it's this one single target that we need to try and hit. But that's not exactly what Paul's talking about here. He's talking about testing and approving God's will. He's talking like a scientist, where you need to come up with a hypothesis, and then you need to test that hypothesis. For me, testing the hypothesis, what I think God's will is for me, means figuring out what the path I think is, and then following that path until I either find out that it is God's will or that it isn't. I have no idea if these issues I've been talking about are going to be part of that path for me, but I think they are, and so I'm just going to run with it until I am shown otherwise. So going back to the video that we actually started with, I have said a really big yes to going down a new road. At the end of the month, which is now 2 weeks away, I'm going to be moving back to Vancouver, British Columbia, and starting a master's degree in computer science. So, yeah. It's going to take at least 2 years, and I have no idea what I'm going to do after that. I might wind up coming back. I might decide that I really love research and go on to do a PhD. I'm really looking forward to moving to Canada. I've got family in Vancouver that I'll be able to see on a weekly basis, which is going to be really awesome. But it does mean that I'm leaving Salthouse, which it's very sad. I'm really grateful for the opportunities I've had to be a part of this community, for being a part of how we find our way of being Christians, how we are different, how we work with and against our cultural norms to bring Jesus' love into our communities. So I just wanted to say a couple of thank yous to everyone here. You guys have really been a part of my story, and I'm really grateful for that. So to finish, I'm just going to leave you with a few questions. First is, how are you also different? How are you strange? How are you new? How are you saying yes and to that? And how does it allow you to test and approve God's good, pleasing, and perfect will? Thank you.
Can we keep those questions up, Anna's questions? And I just want us to keep holding those questions. How are you a weirdo? I love that. I love Anna's embracing of her nonconformist tendencies. And I also love how wrapped into Anna's story is naming that the yes and that we say to the passions within us, or even just the decisions that we're making. So often we say yes, not knowing the outcome, right? We say yes and we're still in process. And I love that Anna's words here, she takes us into what it can look like and feel like to be in the middle of it, right? And what do we notice in the middle there? Man, it's uncomfortable. There are so many unknowns. There are things that are shifting within us. And that those passions, how that plays out will continue to change within us as we live into kind of the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And Anna, she didn't want to, when she did tell me, she's like, well, I don't really want to talk about that. It was kind of what she initially said. And then later she got into more like, I feel differently about it. But she didn't want to talk about it partly because she still felt like she was in the middle of it. She's like, oh, this isn't a finished story yet. I don't want to talk about it yet. I don't know the outcome. I don't know the end of it yet. And we are so hesitant to talk about those things, right? Or even just to name the things that are incomplete in our stories. We want to have a nice bow to tie around and be like, look, here's this thing that happened. Here it is, this whole thing. But most of the time we're living not in the neatly bow-tied moments, but most of the time we're living in between the complete story. We need to do a better job of telling our incomplete stories, don't we? That's what makes Anna's story such a gift. She invites us into grace with ourselves when we're in the middle of the story. She points us towards how we can still say yes while we're in the middle of it and become those scientists. I loved that image, that we get to test and explore and wander and wonder and discover where God is going to take us next. So thank you, Anna, for that. And for the amazing photos of your childhood. So good. And for so many other just layers in your story and for being vulnerable with us about that. So 2 more Sundays, 1 more Sunday? How much? 1 more? 2 more, okay. 2 more Sundays. So we will send you off then, and we will miss you, my friend. So we're going to shift again, holding these questions, just really holding them for ourselves. We open ourselves to consider again. It's Paul's words from Romans, right? As well as Anna's connection to that part of the Jesus story. How might God be inviting you, inviting us to own our non-conforming tendencies, our passions, even if we're still in process? So my friends, really, what is your story now? So we're going to sing and just open up those questions for the next few minutes. And then we'll shift gears a little bit and look beyond these walls as we spend some time in prayer on behalf of our world. So friends, let's pray.